What's up, my readers? Today I will be reading some chapters from Helen Keller by Margaret Davidson. And here is some braille on the back if you can see that. I will be reading 3 chapters. They're not very long. Chapter 1, A Strange Fever. The beginning was happy for Helen. She laughed and loved and grew like any other baby. First she crawled, and then she walked, and then she was learning to talk. Each day was full of adventures. Then everything stopped. One day Helen laughed and played as usual. Next day she lay tossing and turning on her bed. She was very, very sick. The doctor was called, but he could do little to help. A strange fever was burning her up. Probably Helen had scarlet fever. Today there are medicines that wouldn't have made her well. But Helen was born almost 100 years ago, before these medicines were discovered. So day after day, Helen grew weaker. The doctor could not give her mother and father much hope. Helen Keller was only 18 months old. The doctor was sure that she could not live much longer. Then suddenly the fever fell. Helen seemed to be getting better. Mr. and Mrs. Keller sighed with relief. Everything will be all right now, the doctor said. But it wasn't. Dun, dun, dun. Helen slept for many hours. When she woke again, it was morning. The sun was shining through the window. Sunlight splashed across her bed. Mrs. Keller bent over her little girl. She smiled and waved her hand in front of Helen's face. Helen's eyes were wide open. She didn't blink. That was strange. Mrs. Keller waved her hand again closer to Helen's eyes. Helen stared straight ahead. Now Mrs. Keller grabbed a lamp. She shone its bright eyes right into Helen's eyes. Helen kept on staring. Helen's mother began to scream, "Helen's blind! She can't see! My baby's blind!" One morning soon after, Mrs. Keller dressed Helen and sat her down in the middle of the bedroom floor. Just then, a loud bell in the backyard began to ring. This was the Keller family's signal for meals, and Helen loved to eat. Whenever she heard the bell, she trotted to the table as fast as she could, but now she did nothing. Nothing at all. Mrs. Keller was making Helen's bed. "Helen," she said. "Helen?" But Helen didn't move. Mrs. Keller picked up a can of stones, one of Helen's toys. She rattled it in Helen's ear. Helen didn't even turn her head. Then her mother knew. This time she didn't scream. She just bent down and gathered Helen in her arms. "My baby stepped too," she whispered. Chapter 2, Dark Silence. The doctor looked at Helen. He shook his head. "There's nothing I can do." But Helen's father and mother refused to give up hope so easily. Tuscumbia, Alabama was a very small town, and there was only one doctor there. So they took Helen to other doctors in other bigger towns, but the answer was always the same: no hope. Finally, the Kellers understood that Helen would live all her life alone in dark silence. She could not see the brightest light. Soon she could not hear the loudest noise. Soon she forgot the words she had been learning. Then she became dumb. She couldn't speak at all. Helen's body continued to grow, but how could her mind grow in the dark silence? There was so much she could no longer understand. She cried, but she didn't know she was sad. She screamed and kicked, but she didn't know she was angry. She smiled very seldom. She never laughed at all. She wanted people to understand her, but she could not talk to them. She did not know any words. Helen didn't even know her own name. So now Helen began making signs. A nod meant yes. A shake of the head meant no. A pull meant come. A push meant go away. When Helen wanted something big, she spread her hands wide, as if she were holding a big ball. Then she wanted something small, she took a tiny pinch of skin between two fingers. When Helen wanted her mother, she patted her own cheek and made a soft mewing sound. Helen's father wore glasses. Helen liked to feel them, to take them off and put them on her father's nose, when she wanted her father to pretend to put on a pair of glasses too. Soon Helen had 60 signs to tell people what she wanted. Helen tried to find out the world by touching everything she could. The Kellers lived on a small farm. Helen loved to pat the horses and the cows. Her mother taught her how to feed the chickens. Some grew so tame they ate right out of her hand. Then Helen would run her hands over their plump, warm bodies. She liked to touch anything that moved, but there was so much she could not really understand. Helen put her finger on her father's face and hands. She felt him holding a book, so Helen, too, held up a book in front of her face, but she didn't know what books were for. She felt her mother pulling up weeds in the garden, so Helen tried to pull them up too, but how could she know the difference between a weed and a flower? Worst of all were the lips. Again and again, Helen felt other people's lips moving, so she moved her lips too, but she didn't know what moving lips meant. What was everyone doing? What was going on? Helen became more and more angry. Sometimes the feeling of anger was more than she could stand. Then she kicked and screamed and tried to smash everything she touched, but this didn't help either. Helen grew even more angry. Soon not a day passed without a terrible temper tantrum. There was so much she could not know. One day, Helen spilled some water on her apron. She took it off and laid it down in front of the fireplace. But it did not dry fast enough to please her. She moved it closer and closer. Finally, she laid the apron right on top of the flames. The flames shot up through the apron, then to Helen's dress. Fire! She was on fire! Helen screamed. Luckily, someone was in the next room. The fire was put out before it did any harm. But she could have been killed, Mrs. Keller said. Or she could have burned the whole house down, Helen's father answered, with us in it. How much longer could this go on? When Helen was 5 years old, her sister Mildred was born. All Helen knew about this baby was that it took up too much of her mother's time that up until now had belonged to her. Too often when Helen wanted to run into her mother's arms, she found out that the baby was already there. One day, Helen reached out for her doll's crate and found the baby inside. This was too much. Helen growled like an animal. Then she reached out and knocked the cradle over. The baby fell screaming to the floor. Luckily, Mildred wasn't hurt, but what about next time? Helen was growing bigger and wilder every day. Next time she might really hurt the baby, or worse, Helen's father said. Now I'm afraid there's only one thing we can do. We will have to send Helen away. Send her away? Mrs. Keller cried. But where would we send her? But she knew the answer was no. There was only one place that would take a wild creature like Helen. The State Insane Asylum. Let's just wait a little bit longer, Mrs. Keller begged. Mr. Keller nodded, but they both knew that there was no real answer. They both knew that sooner or later, Helen would have to be sent away. Then, one day, Mrs. Keller read about a special school in Boston, Massachusetts, called the Perkins Institute. Perkins was a school for the blind, but once, long ago, the teachers there had taught a little girl who was both blind and deaf. Somehow, they worked out a way to make her understand the whole world. Write to them, Mrs. Keller begged, and maybe they can help Helen too. Helen's father shook his head. He had almost run out of hope, but the night he sat down and wrote a letter to the Perkins Institute. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Chapter 3. The Stranger Comes. What was going on? Helen had known all day that something was. The house had been cleaned from top to bottom. Even the guest room had been opened and aired. Wonderful smells kept coming from the kitchen, and everyone was busy. Much too busy to bother with her. Late in the afternoon, Helen felt her mother put on her hat and her gloves. Helen learned long ago that this meant her mother was going somewhere. so she held on to her mother's skirt. She wanted to go too, but Mrs. Keller pulled her away gently and drove off into the carriage alone. Whatever was going on, Helen didn't like it. She was 6 years old, but she had no words to tell how she felt. Every once in a while she shook her head sadly, and she waited. For a long time nothing happened. Then suddenly Helen stood very still. She seemed to be listening as hard as she could. In a way she was. Not with her ears, but with her whole body. Helen couldn't hear the loudest noise in the world, but sometimes she could feel things slam or shake things around her. She could feel their vibrations coming through the air and the ground. Now she felt the thud of horse hoofs, the vibrations of carriage wheels coming back up the drive. The carriage stopped in front of the porch. Now Helen felt footsteps coming towards her across the porch floor. It must be her mother. Her mother was home at last. Helen held up her arms and felt herself being scooped up. That wasn't her mother. These were a stranger's arms. The stranger was Miss Annie Sullivan. She had come all the way from the Perkins Institute to try and help Helen. But of course Helen didn't know this. All she knew that a stranger was holding her. And Helen didn't like being held by strangers. So she kicked, twisted, and tried to break free. But the stranger's arms only tightened around her. Helen began to growl. Let her go, Miss Annie, Helen's father cried, or she will hurt you. The arms loosened and Helen sprang free. Helen did not like strangers, but she was curious about them. So now she came back. She patted her hand across Annie's face and down her dusty traveling dress. Annie laughed. I can see that she doesn't like to be touched. But she isn't a bit frightened, isn't she? Mr. Keller took his time answering. No, Miss Annie, he finally said, and I think you will sometimes find that that's a problem. Early the next morning, Mrs. Keller led Helen into Annie Sullivan's room. It was for the first time the first lesson to begin. Helen didn't know this, of course, so she just wandered around the room, touching all the new things the stranger had brought with her. One of the first things she found was Annie's suitcase, lying open in the bed. Her curious hands plunged inside. And what was this? Helen's face lit up. She knew right away. It was a doll. She had other things in her room. She wanted this one too. Helen snatched out the suitcase and hugged it close. It's a present for Helen from the little blind girls at Perkins, Annie told Mrs. Keller. It's also a good place to begin as Annie. She picked up Helen's hand. Helen started to tug away, but then she stopped. What was the stranger doing with her hand? This is called the finger alphabet, Annie explained to Helen's mother. It's a way of talking to the deaf. I am making the shapes of the letters D, O, L, L into Helen's palm. Then I will take her hand and run it over the real doll in her arms. You see the first word, and then what the word stands for. The word and what it stands for again. I'm simply trying to connect these two things in her mind. Look at Miss Annie, Mrs. Keller cried. Helen was making those movements too. And she was. Slowly, Helen's fingers were making the shapes of the word doll. What a quick little monkey you are, Annie murmured. She bent down to help. Then she saw the look on Mrs. Keller's face. No, you must not give up your hopes too soon, Annie said quickly. Helen has to learn how to make shapes of her first word. And very fast, too. But she does not know that these shapes stand for all the dolls in the world. She does not know they have meaning. Now, Annie turned back to Helen. So, come on, let's go with the first lesson. Annie pulled the doll out of Helen's arms. She meant to give it back as soon as Helen spelled out the word D-O-O-L again. But Helen didn't know this. All she knew was that a stranger was taking her doll away from her, and she wanted it back. Again and again, Helen reached for the doll, but her hand only touched an empty air. She began to growl. Look out, Miss Annie, Mrs. Keller cried, but her warning came a little late. Helen came charging. Her fist shot out, and she hit Annie right in the mouth. Helen could not hear her pain-filled cry, but she could feel the stranger jerk away. She smiled. Oh, let her have the doll, Mrs. Keller cried. It's the only way to calm her. No, Annie said, there is another way. Helen must learn self-control. But Helen doesn't know what self-control is, Mrs. Keller answered. She doesn't know how to keep her temper. That is the first lesson I must teach her, Annie said. For I do not think I can teach her anything else until I do. Helen came charging again, but this time Annie was ready for her. She grabbed Helen's arms and hung on as tight as she could. Helen kicked and screamed for quite a while. Then suddenly she went limp. So, my girl, Annie said, have you had enough? Are you ready to go on? But it was a trick. As soon as Annie let go, Helen ran away from the room. She would not come back all day. Helen slept as well as ever that night, but Annie Sullivan didn't. She lay in bed and thought about Helen. Annie had been in Tuscumbia for only one day, but she already knew that everyone in the house felt too sorry for Helen. They had let her have her own way for years. Now she was badly spoiled. And this must stop, Annie thought. For how can I reach her mind while she rants and rages like a wild animal? No, I must be loving, but firm. That is the best way to help Helen. Okay, thanks for listening. I will read the rest of the chapters this week. Oh, bye.